You think you understand what happens inside a black hole. You don't. You believe the mystery lies in extreme gravity, crushed matter, or an unreachable center hidden behind darkness. You imagine something violent, catastrophic, perhaps chaotic. That confidence comes from familiarity with collapse, with destruction, with things breaking under pressure. But a black hole is not defined by what breaks. It is defined by what stops making sense. And the moment you realize this, the comfort of your intuition begins to fail. Your certainty depends on a quiet assumption that space and time remain reliable even under extreme conditions. You accept that objects can be torn apart, that forces can grow enormous, but you still expect events to unfold in sequence, causes to precede effects, and locations to remain locations. You imagine crossing a boundary and continuing inward, as if the universe simply becomes harsher but remains conceptually intact. That expectation is wrong. Discomfort begins when you understand that a black hole is not an object sitting in space. It is a region where the structure of space-time itself is altered so completely that ordinary distinctions collapse. The boundary you call the event horizon is not a surface in the usual sense. Nothing physical happens there locally. No wall, no shock, no signal announces you're crossing. And yet, once crossed, the meaning of later changes in a way intuition cannot accommodate. Outside the black hole, time behaves as you expect. Inside, time does not merely slow down or distort, it reorients. What you thought was a direction becomes unavoidable. Movement toward the center is no longer optional. It is as compulsory as moving into the future. You cannot remain where you are, not because something pulls you, but because space-time itself no longer allows alternatives. The center is not a place you fall toward. It is a moment you fall into. This is where contradiction becomes unavoidable. You think of the center as a location, something you could in principle avoid or orbit. But inside a black hole, the center is not somewhere ahead of you in space. It is ahead of you in time. Just as you cannot stop tomorrow from arriving, you cannot stop the center from being reached. Resistance has no meaning here. Acceleration has no relevance. Choice does not apply. At this point, intuition attempts to retreat. You imagine that if nothing can escape, then everything must be crushed into a single point, destroyed beyond recognition. This image feels terrifying because it mirrors familiar violence. But it is also incomplete. The real disturbance is not the destruction of matter. It is the destruction of predictability. The laws you rely on to describe evolution no longer extend smoothly inward. They do not fail abruptly. They simply lose their domain. The deeper mechanism reveals itself when you confront the singularity. It is not an object. It is not a place filled with infinite density in the way imagination suggests. It is a signal that the description you are using has reached its limit. Space and time, treated as continuous and well-behaved, can no longer be extended. The singularity is not where something happens. It is where description stops. This is profoundly unsettling because it means the interior of a black hole is not merely hidden. It is undefined in the way your questions demand definition. Asking what happens inside assumes that happening remains a meaningful concept. It does not. Events require time. Locations require space. Near the singularity, both dissolve into a boundary where those categories no longer function. This is why information becomes such a problem here. You assume that whatever falls in must leave a trace of what it was. But trace requires sequence. It requires that states evolve in a way that can be compared. Inside a black hole, the framework that supports such comparison is no longer reliable. The question of what survives is inseparable from the question of what can still be said. The unavoidable conclusion begins to form quietly. A black hole is not terrifying because it destroys you. It is terrifying because it removes the conditions under which destruction and survival can be meaningfully distinguished. It does not kill in the way intuition expects. It ends the applicability of the concepts you use to describe existence at all. Once you accept this, the fear changes character. It is no longer about pain, pressure, or annihilation. It is about the realization that the universe contains regions where your most basic explanatory tools are invalid, not because reality is chaotic, but because it is too consistent to accommodate them. If the interior of a black hole forces time itself to become a direction you cannot avoid, what does that say about your belief that motion and choice are always separate? The initial shock does not settle into clarity. It sharpens into a more unsettling realization. Even after accepting that the center of a black hole is not a place but an unavoidable future, you may still believe that whatever happens inside remains, in principle, describable. That if the right theory existed, the interior would become just another extreme environment. This belief feels reasonable because it has worked before. Many regions of the universe once seemed inaccessible until better descriptions revealed them. But a black hole resists this pattern in a fundamental way. Discomfort deepens when you recognize that the event horizon is not merely a boundary of escape, but a boundary of communication. Once crossed, no signal can return to influence the outside. This is not because signals are weak or slow. It is because the structure of space-time itself forbids outward influence. Cause and effect are no longer symmetric across the boundary. From the outside, the interior freezes. From the inside, the outside becomes unreachable. These descriptions are not contradictory. They are both correct, and that fact alone should unsettle you. Here, the contradiction becomes explicit. You are accustomed to believing that physics describes the same reality for everyone, differing only in perspective. Inside and outside a black hole, that belief fractures. The ordering of events depends on where you are. What you call now outside does not align with any now inside. The universe does not provide a single, shared timeline that threads through the horizon. It tolerates incompatible descriptions without resolving them into one. Intuition attempts another defense. You may think the interior is simply hidden, not fundamentally different, that if one could look inside without being destroyed, the same laws would apply. But this assumes the laws require an observer to function. They do not. The laws describe structure, not experience. And the structure inside a black hole does not preserve the assumptions that allow your familiar laws to operate smoothly. The deeper mechanism emerges when you consider what happens to information. Outside, you rely on the idea that information persists, that states evolve reversibly at a fundamental level. Inside a black hole, that expectation becomes strained. Information that crosses the horizon cannot be retrieved by any process that respects causality as defined outside. From the external perspective, the interior becomes causally disconnected, sealed off from the rest of the universe. The universe allows this disconnection without apology. This leads to a deeply uncomfortable realization. The black hole does not simply hide information. It challenges the idea that information must always be accessible in principle. You expect reality to be globally consistent in a way that preserves retrievability. The universe does not guarantee this. It only guarantees local consistency. Beyond that, your expectations are not consulted. As you follow this logic inward, the notion of a smooth interior begins to dissolve. The closer you approach the singularity, the less meaningful comparison becomes. Distances lose stability, durations lose coherence. The very idea of tracking a system through time loses its footing. This is not because physics becomes sloppy. It is because the assumptions required to define tracking no longer apply. The unavoidable conclusion starts to take shape. A black hole is not a region where known physics is merely extreme. It is a region where the framework that makes physics intelligible begins to fail. Not because the universe breaks its own rules, but because the rules were never meant to extend there without modification. This is what makes the interior terrifying in a precise sense. It is not the violence of forces or the destruction of matter. It is the presence of a boundary beyond which explanation itself degrades. The universe contains regions where asking what happens next is no longer a well-formed question. If explanation depends on the ability to compare states across time, what does it mean to insist on an explanation in a region where time itself no longer supports comparison? The resistance that remains now is subtle but decisive. Even after accepting that explanation degrades inside a black hole, you may still believe that degradation is temporary, that it signals an incomplete theory rather than a fundamental limit. You expect that once gravity and quantum structure are reconciled, the interior will regain coherence, sequence, and describability. This expectation is not unreasonable. It is also not supported by what the structure already implies. Discomfort intensifies when you realize that limits do not always mark ignorance. Sometimes they mark the point at which extension destroys meaning. Inside a black hole, the difficulty is not that variables become hard to calculate. It is that the concepts those variables depend on cease to be globally applicable. Time does not merely become short, it becomes non-comparable. Space does not merely become curved, it loses the property that allows distances to be ordered consistently. The problem is not insufficient resolution, it is incompatibility. Here, the contradiction becomes unavoidable. You believe that a more complete theory must preserve explanation everywhere. Yet the very idea of explanation relies on continuity, on the ability to relate one state to another without ambiguity. Inside a black hole, space-time does not provide that continuity in the way explanation requires. If a theory restored it fully, it would not be extending current understanding. It would be contradicting the structure that defines the horizon in the first place. The deeper mechanism clarifies this tension. A black hole is defined not by what is inside it, but by how boundaries behave. The event horizon is not a material surface. It is a causal boundary. Once crossed, the set of events that can influence you changes irreversibly. This is not a local effect. It is global. It reorganizes what it means for events to be related at all. Any description that ignores this reorganization fails to describe the black hole rather than transcending it. This is why the singularity cannot be treated as just another physical state waiting to be understood. It is not a dense object awaiting inspection. It is the endpoint of a coordinate system. The moment you try to describe it as something that exists within time, you have already stepped outside the conditions that define it. The singularity is not where physics becomes violent. It is where extension becomes illegitimate. Another intuition collapses here. You assume that reality must remain observer-independent in the strongest sense. That whatever happens inside must be equally describable from all frames, even if inaccessible. But the universe does not promise this. It promises consistency, not universality of description. Inside a black hole, consistency is preserved locally, while global comparison is sacrificed. This trade is not accidental, it is structural. This leads to a realization that is difficult to accept without discomfort. The interior of a black hole may not be a place where a single, complete narrative exists. Not because the universe is fragmented, but because narrative itself is a local construction. The demand for a single story that covers both sides of the horizon is a demand the universe does not satisfy. At this depth, The fear associated with black holes changes again. It is no longer about falling, compression, or erasure. It is about encountering a region where the tools that make reality intelligible to you are not merely strained, but inapplicable. The black hole does not hide a secret you are forbidden to know. It exposes a boundary beyond which knowing, as you define it, no longer functions. The unavoidable conclusion sharpens without resolution. A black hole is terrifying not because of what it does to matter, but because of what it does to meaning. It preserves consistency by abandoning comparability. It maintains order by removing the conditions under which order can be described globally. This is not a failure of the universe. It is a consequence of its refusal to violate its own structure. If reality remains consistent even when explanation itself loses coherence, what does that imply about your expectation that every region of the universe must remain understandable in human terms? What remains now is not an unanswered question, but a final expectation that refuses to dissolve. Even after accepting that the interior of a black hole resists explanation, you may still believe that reality must remain continuous in a way that preserves meaning everywhere, that even if descriptions fail, something coherent must still be happening in the way you understand coherence. This belief feels almost moral. It feels like a requirement. The universe does not recognize it. At this depth, the black hole reveals its most unsettling feature. It is not a place where reality becomes violent. It is a place where reality becomes indifferent to interpretation. Inside the horizon, the universe does not struggle to remain intelligible. It does not attempt to preserve a story. It simply maintains internal consistency and abandons everything else. Meaning is not destroyed, it is made optional. This discomfort intensifies when you realize that the laws of physics do not promise global comprehensibility. They promise only that contradictions do not arise locally. Outside the black hole, this distinction is invisible because your environment allows both. Inside, the separation becomes absolute. The universe keeps its rules intact by surrendering the idea that those rules must remain narratable from every perspective at once. Here, the final contradiction collapses. You want to believe that understanding is a property of reality itself, that if something exists, it must be understandable in principle. But understanding is not a universal property. It is an emergent one. It depends on conditions that allow comparison, memory, and sequence. A black hole does not violate understanding. It removes the conditions that support it. The deeper mechanism completes the picture. The black hole is not a failure of physics waiting to be repaired. It is a demonstration of how far physics can go without accommodating human expectation. It shows that space-time can remain lawful while abandoning the features that make law feel interpretable. The universe does not collapse when explanation ends. It continues, unaffected. This is why attempts to soften the interior always fail. You imagine exotic matter, hidden dimensions, or alternate continuations that preserve story and sequence. These ideas persist because they protect intuition. But intuition is not a constraint the universe respects. The black hole stands as evidence that reality can be fully consistent while remaining partially inaccessible to explanation as you define it. At the singularity, this becomes absolute. There is no further extension, no deeper interior, no next moment to analyze. Not because something dramatic happens, but because the coordinate system that allows drama ceases to exist. The universe does not explode into chaos. It ends description quietly. That silence is not ignorance. It is precision. The terror associated with this realization is not emotional. It is structural. You are confronted with a universe that does not guarantee that every what happens has an answer, not because it is mysterious, but because the question itself depends on assumptions that no longer apply. The black hole does not erase you. It erases the framework that allows erasure to be described. The unavoidable conclusion stands without appeal. A black hole is terrifying because it proves that reality does not need to remain interpretable to remain real. It shows that the universe values consistency over comprehension, structure over story, and coherence over comfort. Nothing inside the black hole violates the universe. It violates only your expectations. If the universe can remain perfectly consistent while abandoning the conditions that make it understandable to you, what does that suggest about how much of reality your intuition was ever entitled to grasp?